Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little video that I found very particularly interesting. And this was a video that I believe actually was released quite a while ago, at least a couple to maybe a few months ago when it came down to it. But the reason why we're going to be talking about it today is because I've been hearing more and more news overall about this subject for really through the grapevine now for the past few months. And I've been hearing this news pretty much ever since that the trilogy had ended. And overall, there has been a definitive, basically, victor, overall of that trilogy. And of course, that is the Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder trilogy. And of course, the big question is about both of those fighters is where are they going to go from here? And those are not the only fighters within the heavyweight division that we have a big question about. Of course, we have a big question about who maybe Alexander Usyk is going to face next, and also about Mr. Anthony Joshua as well. And the big question is about those three heavyweights that were pretty much on top of the world for the past 5 years. Where are they going to go from here? Because Anthony Joshua, he's in a very precarious position. He's a person all in all that already has 2 losses on his record, was the former somewhat unified heavyweight champion of the world, but now, of course, no longer has any of those titles. He could maybe decide to face a tune-up fight or face Alexander Usyk in a rematch. I don't think that facing him in an immediate rematch, in my opinion, would be the best of decisions, but that's his opinion. Deontay Wilder, of course, is in a very precarious position because overall, within his last 2 fights, he ended up losing, and not only did he end up losing, but he ended up pretty much getting mollywopped. It just is what it is. But the big question is about Deontay Wilder, because the rumors that I've been hearing is that Deontay Wilder, that he may decide to retire. Now, if you're asking me all in all, do I think that Deontay Wilder should retire, or do I think that he should continue fighting on? Well, if you were to ask me personally, I think it's really up to Deontay Wilder. And of course, you could say that for any fighter. Listen, there are certain fighters to where I would recommend that they retire today. Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., in my opinion, is a fighter that should retire today. Victor Ortiz, if he's going to continue on, he should retire today. There are certain fighters that they continue fighting on, and it's like, man, come on, you lived a good life. You were maybe able to win a title here and there. Why would you continue fighting on and taking the type of punishment that you are? Deontay Wilder, what I'll say about him is this. The last 2 punishments that he took within those last 2 fights against Tyson Fury, it was very, very damaging, in my opinion, to him. And there's a very decent possibility that we more than likely are never going to see the same Deontay Wilder or even the same threat from Deontay Wilder ever again. But what I will say is this. If Deontay Wilder maybe does want to continue fighting on or maybe face 1 or 2 competitors, 1 or 2 challengers, I think that maybe it would be in his best interest to maybe go after an Anthony Joshua fight or maybe go after an Andrew Ruiz Jr., one of those couple fights, because those guys are going to be remembered as decent heavyweights back in the day, or at least during your day when it comes down to it. And if Deontay Wilder can get a win over one of those 2 guys, even over just an Andrew Ruiz Jr., he will be remembered as one of the greatest heavyweights overall of his time and probably of all time. Now, is that me necessarily saying that I believe that he's Muhammad Ali? Is that me saying that he's a top 10 heavyweight of all time? No, not necessarily. To be honest with you, I don't know if Deontay Wilder would even make my top 20 heavyweights of all time. But at least if you were actually able to beat Andrew Ruiz, maybe even an Anthony Joshua, he could be remembered somewhat within that top 20 scale, maybe, if you were to put him there. But anyways, Mr. Fannon, he was going to talk about the possibility of Deontay Wilder retiring. I'm going to talk about it as well. And of course, as we know, Mr. Fannon, he is a very big Deontay Wilder fan, so this should be very interesting. But let's get into it. Let's see what he has to say.
All right, welcome back to the channel. So, shocking news. Deontay Wilder, according to himself in an interview that he gave to Kevin Hart, is considering retirement. Would be a big hit to the heavyweight division, take a lot of excitement out of the heavyweight division. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fannon. Make sure, if you would not mind, if you don't have a chance to listen all the way to the end of the video, I'd appreciate it if you could listen all the way to the end of the video. Hit the like button, share button, subscribe, do all that good stuff. It really does help grow the channel. Man, this is something that I heard this morning on a podcast with Kevin Hart. Absolutely sad type of deal for me, man, who's a really, really big Deontay Wilder fan. Deontay Wilder is considering retirement. He told Kevin Hart on his show that, you know, he pretty much had accomplished everything that he wanted to accomplish in his professional career, that there's really nothing out there left for him to do in boxing, and that he had promised his daughter.
You know, when I listen to Deontay Wilder speak about boxing at this point in time, I think that there's a part of him that does want to continue fighting on. But I think that, you know, he is at least intelligent enough, and I don't think Deontay Wilder is the most intelligent brother in the world, but it just is what it is. At least it seems like he is intelligent enough to know that, you know, this boxing thing, that maybe it has finally run its course. And, you know, you can tell that Deontay Wilder, that it seems, at least to me, that he already kind of has one foot out the door. And in my opinion, if you kind of already have one foot out the door, especially in a sport that can be this damaging to you, there are certain sports, like whether you be in MMA or boxing or football, to where, you know, the injuries that you sustain when it comes down to it, or that you can attain within your career, that if you really don't have the motivation to do it anymore, why do it? Because at the end of the day, you know, yes, you're doing it for your enjoyment, but, you know, if you've already accomplished a decent amount in your career, and Deontay Wilder, listen, like I said, I don't think he's necessarily one of the all-time greats, but he is a person all in all that is going to make the Hall of Fame, in my opinion. He did overall defend his title 10 times. He did win the WBC championship belt over Bermane Stiverne, who was one of the legitimate champions. Do I think that Deontay Wilder has an all-time great resume? No, I do not. But what I will say is this. Would I necessarily claim that Deontay Wilder is a hype job? Well, it depends on what your definition of a hype job is. I'm a person that, you know, unless you're a person that has pretty much almost lost every big fight in your career, I would not really claim that you were a hype job. A hype job, to me, in my opinion, is maybe someone like an Adrian Broner. That's what a hype job is, in my opinion. I don't think that Deontay Wilder necessarily was a hype job. What I will say is that he certainly cannot be remembered as the best heavyweight of his generation. And I'm not even quite sure if he can be remembered as the second best of his generation. But we're going to talk about that here in a bit.
When his daughter was a year old, that she was going to win a championship belt for her. And then when he won that championship, you know, that he was going to be able to provide for her for the rest of her life beyond her wildest dreams. And he has now accomplished that. So
what I will say is this, and I was saying this for the majority of Deontay Wilder's career. His 10 title defenses are not going to be looked back upon and said, oh my God, you know, this dude actually was able to defend his 10 titles against Artur Spilska and Johan Duapas and yada, 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 yada. Deontay Wilder nowhere near has an A-grade resume. And I've seen certain channels or certain people, when it comes down to it, they may criticize another fighter that maybe did not have the most elite of resumes, and they may call them a hype job, but then they don't include other fighters that maybe would fit the same billing if that's the same logic that you're going to apply to. And if you're a person that, you know, let's say, for example, because Fannon and a certain amount of these other channels that I've seen, they'll call someone like a Gennady Golovkin a hype job, for example. Why? Because their logic basically was, well, Gennady Golovkin, at least, you know, when he was the number uno threat, when it came down to it, numero uno threat, when it came down to it, because he was within the top ranks of the pound-for-pound list, they basically said that he was a complete hype job because Gennady Golovkin lost the biggest fight of his career against Canelo, and, you know, he doesn't really have that great of a resume. And I understand to a degree what they're saying, but if you're going to have that same energy with Gennady Triple G Golovkin, you know, then you have to have the same energy with Deontay Wilder. Because Gennady Golovkin, at the end of the day, at least what I'll say about him is that he has a win over a first ballot Hall of Famer, in my opinion, in Danny Jacobs. And Canelo, in my opinion, certainly is a first ballot Hall of Famer, and Gennady Golovkin not only got a draw in that first fight, many people would allege, including myself, that Gennady Golovkin deserved the victory over Canelo. And in the rematch, you can maybe even argue that Gennady Golovkin deserved the draw as well. So it's not like a Deontay Wilder-Tyson Fury situation where, yeah, the first fight was a draw, but it pretty much was a robbery. It is what it is. You know, at least with Gennady Triple G Golovkin, we know that he was somewhat of a real deal fighter. No, his title defenses did not really always come against the greatest competition. But I don't think that Bernard Hopkins at the middleweight division always had the greatest of competition either. I don't think, all in all, that just because you did not always face against the greatest of competition does not mean that you were not somewhat of a great fighter. And Gennady Golovkin, in my opinion, was an extraordinarily great fighter. And when you talk about Deontay Wilder, to a degree, I think he was a great fighter. I don't think that he was ever a greatly skilled fighter. But in my opinion, I would say that he does make the Hall of Fame.
You know, he says...
And some people, of course, they come on my channel and I say certain things about certain fighters like Gennady Golovkin or Deontay Wilder or Vasily Lomachenko or even Charlo or some other people, and they'll say, you know, wow, you have those guys making the Hall of Fame. How could you say that? That's preposterous. That's ridiculous. Well, not really, because like I said, the Boxing Hall of Fame, they're not really known for having their high amount of standards. Now, if you're talking about the NFL Hall of Fame when it comes down to it, then yes, that's a league overall to where they have a very high amount of standards. But when you talk about, like I said, when you talk about boxing, that's not a league all in all. That's not a sport to where their Hall of Fame is extremely high. Like I said, in my opinion, even Adrian Broner and Paulie Malignaggi would make the Hall of Fame. Would I say that those fighters are greater than Deontay Wilder? I'm not so sure about that.
He's asking himself, do I push on even though I've accomplished everything that I need to accomplish? And to me, it sounded like a guy that had his foot. Then that's the first time that I'd ever heard Deontay Wilder sound like that, or even got a sense that Deontay Wilder was thinking that.
I agree. And it's unfortunate to see that a lot of his fans now have turned their back on him, or that some of them have pretty much thrown him under the bus like a Dante's Boxing Nation, or made excuses. But that's what happens a lot of the times when certain people, especially boxers, when they lose fights. People basically drop them like a bad habit when before they were very big fans because, basically they can't be a fan of them anymore because they disappointed them in that big fight. So it is what it is. So what I'll say about Deontay Wilder is just from a logical and objective perspective. Once again, was he ever a greatly skilled fighter? No, he wasn't. But you can somewhat say in terms of his style that he kind of was like the George Foreman of this era. Yes, he was only a Plan A fighter. Yes, he was a fighter that, did not really have the greatest of skills, but he was a decently great fighter. And if he went in there overall, with the right amount of training and the right amount of a tempo, he could potentially win the fight.
He sounded like a guy in that little bit. Now, admittedly, this is something, that could have been edited. He could have been maybe said some things longer, in a longer conversation. But he's a guy that in that interview sounded like he had one foot out the door. He said that, he had other things that he was working on in his, as far as being like a licensed scuba diver and enjoying traveling the world, scuba diving with his girlfriend or his wife.
And like I said, in my opinion, if you're a person that in boxing especially is not serious about it, my advice overall to certain people, especially that if you are actually trying to get into professional boxing, or if you overall, really were interested in it, I think that you really almost have to be obsessed with the sport. And I'm obsessed to the sport even to a degree, and I don't always think that it's a great thing to be obsessed with things, but I am obsessed overall with certain sports. I am obsessed overall with boxing. That's why I talk about it a lot. If you don't eat and shit and breathe boxing, in my opinion, if you don't run the miles daily, if you don't do the push-ups, if overall you don't do the exercises, work on your cardio, do the sparring, hit the heavy bag when it comes down to it, it's just way too dangerous of a sport, in my opinion, to participate in if you're not going all the way, in my opinion. And if Deontay Wilder, even though I think that he still has a little bit of heart for the sport, I think a part of him in his mind says, you know what, maybe this boxing thing, when it comes down to it, maybe my career's over. I pretty much accomplished everything that I needed to accomplish. I was not a person that ever was expected to even get on this level, but because of my great athletic gifts and somewhat, to my all-around package, I was actually able to get the WBC championship and defend it 10 times.
Also, he said that he's got some other business interests and things that he's, fragrances that he was trying to sell. Now, if he's talking about, fragrances, he's probably talking about, doing some of the things that his wife wants to do or his girlfriend wants to do. I see she has a podcast, so he may be trying to get in, behind her and support her and what she's doing. But, when you're in a hurt business like especially the heavyweight division in boxing, if it's in your heart is not all the way in it and you don't really think that you have, really anything else to work for, it probably is the better time to retire. As far as, him needing a rest, people are asking me on.
I agree with Fannon there because in my opinion, if you're in the sport of boxing or if you're in the sport of MMA, basically what your job is, even though we may not always look at it as this being as barbaric, to a degree, basically what it is that there's a possibility that if you damage your opponent enough, you may actually kill your own opponent. It just is what it is. And I know a certain amount of people, they may not take that as seriously, but there is a certain amount of boxers, there's a certain amount of fighters, that have died or suffered very, very serious injuries. So like I said, if you're not fully motivated, if you're a person that already is kind of wondering, maybe should I retire? In my opinion, you already know the answer. Because as Fannon just said, this is a hurt business. And a lot of these boxers, they're pretty much natural born killers. I know a lot of people, they'll take a look at that and they'll say, oh, you're going a little bit too far with that. But some of these boxers, basically what they sign up to do is, listen, if it comes to that final blow, that, overall may make you never the same again, physically and mentally. But if I have to do it overall to propel my career and, overall put money in my bank accounts and put food on my family's plate, I have to do what I have to do. It just is what it is.
On my live stream, what I thought, who I thought Deontay Wilder should fight next. And my take on that was, look, man, Deontay Wilder probably needs to take, a good amount of time off. The last two fights that he had with Tyson Fury were absolutely brutal fights. Took a lot of punishment in those fights. And with a guy, that he dished out a lot of punishment for sure. But, when we're considering whether or not, Deontay Wilder needs to continue or not, you got to look at what the punishment that he took. And he definitely took a lot of punishment from Tyson Fury in those last two fights. So with the dent in his head and all of those other things, it may be the time for him.
Well, there was never a dent in his head. You were one of the fools overall that fell for that because you wanted to believe that Deontay Wilder got cheated, but he never did get cheated. It is what it is. He is the one that cheated himself because he was the one overall that never wanted to improve on his boxing ability until he realized that it was a little bit too late. And by the time that he did that, he probably was neither the same fighter, neither, nor mentally or physically, or at least not completely the same. Like I said, the Deontay Wilder that I seen in the third fight, it pretty much was the same Deontay Wilder that I had seen, but he was not going to come in there more than likely with the same confidence or, all in all, with the same, swagger, if you want to basically say it like that. He was not going to come into that fight like that because Fury already basically killed him mentally. He was living in his head rent-free. It just is what it is. You cannot suffer an ass whooping like that and your opponent overall, does not instill some sort of fear within you. But it is what it is.
To really sit down and consider, getting out of there, getting out when you're ahead. He's made a ton of money, probably more money than he had ever expected to make as a professional athlete when he came in the game. He was a championship. He had a championship, held his championship for 10 title defenses, championed for over 5 years, one of the longest reigning heavyweight champions that they've...
Right, but let's talk about, the 5-year belts, or let's talk about the 5-year reigning championship, all this stuff, because it's no offense against Deontay Wilder. Like I said, this is not a hating video, but this is just a logical and objective perspective, at least in my view. When we talk about, it's so funny with some of these channels or with some people, depending on which fighters they like, which they like, because Mr. Fannon, he talks about Gennady Golovkin in a completely opposite light. And I don't always think that Fannon is, a bad person to listen to. I don't think that he necessarily has a bad channel. But you can tell that he has a little bit of biasness here and there. Especially against Gennady Golovkin. He does not like Gennady Golovkin. A lot of these channels, all in all, do not like Gennady Triple G Golovkin. But if you're going to overall be one of those guys like a Fannon, like a Dante's Boxing Nation that claim that, Gennady Triple G Golovkin never defended his titles against anyone that elite, you would also have to mention that with Deontay Wilder. And in my opinion, when it comes to Gennady Golovkin, you have to say that he beat not only more impressive opponents, but that he was a much greater fighter. That he was a person, all in all, that not only had more title defenses for his division, but on top of that, he was a person that actually was able to get 2 very competitive fights with the current #1 pound-for-pound fighter in Canelo Alvarez. He also was a person that, in my opinion, all in all, was a much smarter and more skilled fighter than a Deontay Wilder. But, that's kind of where Deontay Wilder, in my opinion, lies. I would put Gennady Golovkin, of course, in my opinion, as greater than Deontay Wilder, no doubt about it. But that's kind of where he is. He's in that Gennady Golovkin, he's almost like the Aaron Pryor of his day. Someone that so many people really love to hype up, but when you really take a look at their resume, it's just not super duper impressive. People always love to tell you about, their title defenses and how they were so avoided, blah, 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 blah. But when you actually take a look at them, it's like, I've seen better. It is what it is. It was kind of the same thing with Deontay Wilder, in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, great to a degree. Do I think that he's a first ballot Hall of Famer? No question about it. Any person that has 10 title defenses, and he was able to beat Luis Ortiz and Bermane Stiverne, I wouldn't necessarily call those guys first ballot Hall of Famers, but they were at least decent fighters. Yes, Deontay Wilder, in my opinion, is a first ballot Hall of Famer. Did he defeat the greatest in competition? No, he did not, but I think that he does deserve his place overall in the history of boxing.
So, the guy has probably made it to the Hall of Fame based off what he's done as a knockout artist and all of that. Probably has, will have the ability to come back and do different talking, different cover different fights like Andre Ward and those guys have done on occasion. Wouldn't put that past him. So, if he wanted to call it a day, I would say, hey man, it's probably not.
Well, he could call certain fights, but what is Deontay Wilder gonna say in the commentary booth? Yeah, you gotta land the right hand. You just, gotta gotta try to swing it in there. Like what advice is Deontay Wilder gonna give anyone? I mean, there's no offense against him, but
Not the worst choice in the world. When you look at what's out there for him in the heavyweight division, you're going to have a lot of, he's still obviously going to be an attraction, obviously because he's an exciting fighter and somebody that has a lot of name recognition. But the other really big fights that are out there for him, like maybe, the Anthony Joshua fight, Andy Ruiz says that he wants to fight him. Those are all a lot smaller fighters, the fights, than the ones that he had with Tyson Fury, which I think pretty much did settle.
I don't necessarily think all in all that they would be much smaller, but I do think all in all that, of course, they would not be big as the Tyson Fury trilogy. It just is what it is. Anthony Joshua, in my opinion, that still all in all is a fight that I think a lot of people would love to see. I would still love to see the fight. If Deontay Wilder were to continue going on boxing, in my opinion, the only two fights that are legitimately, make sense for his career at this given moment in time would either be an AJ Anthony Joshua fight or an Andrew Ruiz Jr. fight. Those are the only fights, in my opinion, that not only could possibly boost your legacy and maybe determine where you rank within, this certain times of these great heavyweights, but on top of that, it would give you a decent payday. So you would be decently set up for the rest of your life.
The issue about who the best heavyweight in the world is, and Tyson Fury proved that was him. There's no shame in that, being the second best heavyweight, and making
right. But is Deontay Wilder really the second best heavyweight or the second greatest heavyweight of his era? When we talk about this heavyweight era, there was four main heavyweights that we really have to talk about, maybe five if you want to include Alexander Usyk as well. There's no question, in my opinion, who number one is. It has to be Tyson Fury. He embarrassed Vladimir Klitschko. He embarrassed Deontay Wilder on 3 separate occasions, in my opinion. Then you have Anthony Joshua, who, in my opinion, may debatably be second or third if you want to count Vladimir Klitschko in this era as well. Deontay Wilder, in my opinion, you may actually even be able to argue him in last place. Now, could you maybe debate him in second place? It depends. Tyson Fury, of course, in my opinion, is on top. If you do not want to include Vladimir Klitschko in the era, then maybe Deontay Wilder could be second. But in my opinion, more than likely, he would be third. It just is what it is. And some people would not even debate him over Alexander Usyk in terms of a heavyweight fighter. I maybe would just because of the title defenses. Now, of course, Alexander Usyk, you certainly can argue that he was the greater heavyweight of the two because Alexander Usyk has that very fantastic win over Anthony AJ Joshua, and Deontay Wilder doesn't have any win like that in his career. Now, in terms of great fighter, or all in all, just all-around greater fighter, or in terms of the all-time great conversation, is Alexander Usyk above Deontay Wilder? Yeah, no question about it. But just in terms of a greater heavyweight, just because Usyk has not really had, a great amount of heavyweight battles there, and just in case maybe he were to lose the rematch against AJ, we'll see. We'll see.
Millions and millions of dollars doing it. So if he was to retire, I don't think that there's any shame in it. But it would, be a circumstance where, I think that the people that would look back on that and think, man, I really blew an opportunity would be a guy like Anthony Joshua. If Anthony Joshua would have fought Deontay Wilder when Deontay Wilder had that belt and Anthony Joshua had his 3 belts, it would have been for an undisputed title, would have been one of the biggest fights that we could have possibly had in the heavyweight division for years. It would have been a bigger fight than the fight between Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, especially since...
Well, I agree in certain terms that Anthony Joshua at times did not always seem the most interested in the Deontay Wilder fight. But let's not just act like Deontay Wilder was all gung-ho about the fight either. Because there was a lot of the times where Deontay Wilder said, oh, you have to come to the U.S., and basically all the Deontay Wilder fans, they ate that up. Well, if you're going to knock out Anthony Joshua anyway or beat him no problem, you shouldn't have a problem going to his home soil. Because Anthony Joshua clearly was the A side. So it is what it is.
Anthony Joshua, has lost 2 times. Once to Andy Ruiz.
Now, a certain amount of people, I may also have to make a video about the Novak Djokovic versus Rafael Nadal conversation. There's this one gentleman, I believe, that was talking to me, and he was trying to make the point. He was saying, oh, well, you're not answering my question, fess up when it comes down to it. You say that Novak Djokovic is a greater player than Nadal, at least debatably, and in my opinion, he would be. Now, Nadal, of course, does have, now one more Grand Slam than Djokovic, so if you wanted to debate Nadal, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. And of course, this, not to digress too much, but this is a separate conversation. But one of the points that he usually brought up to me, was that, well, Djokovic, he has the disadvantage over Nadal in Grand Slam tournaments. And, yeah, he might have the leading record, but, he has the disadvantage in, Grand Slam tournaments. That would be a great point if basically Rafael Nadal beat Novak Djokovic in almost every single tournament, or beat him in, 3/4 or, 4 out of 4 tournaments, in every single Grand Slam. But that's not the case. Because Novak Djokovic, when it came down to it, when he ended up losing those tournaments, when it came down to the majority of them, usually were in the French Open or in the Roland Garros, which is Rafael Nadal's most dominant stage out of all the 4 Grand Slams. Does Rafael Nadal also have the advantage in the US Open? Yes, by 1, I believe. But Novak Djokovic also has the advantage in 2 other Grand Slams. Rafael Nadal, I don't even think he's ever been able to defeat Novak Djokovic once in the Australian Open. Almost every single time that Novak Djokovic and Nadal have faced, I believe that Novak Djokovic has almost clearly beat him. Besides that one 2012, I believe, finals that happened many, many years ago. But it is what it is. That's why, in my opinion, you can't always just take a look at the Grand Slam totals, because tennis is a little bit different compared to other sports. It's kind of the same thing in boxing. Yes, does Anthony Joshua, does he have a couple of losses? Yes, can you make the argument that Deontay, well, at least when he lost to the best heavyweight of his generation? You certainly can make that argument. I don't have a problem with it. But I think we also have to put things in the context that when we take a look at the resume, and when we take a look at Anthony Joshua's resume, his skill set, and also what he has accomplished, he just beats him in almost every single category. He certainly beats him overall in skill set, in my opinion, in terms of overall his boxing ability. I don't think that either fighter really has that high a boxing IQ. But if they were to retire today, who in my opinion would be the greater fighter, it has to be Anthony Joshua. Yes, you lost, overall to the best fighter of the day, but what's to say all in all that you would have not lost to someone like an Andrew Ruiz Jr. or an Anthony Joshua, because you never fought those guys. It just is what it is. Not saying that every single time it was always Deontay Wilder's fault, but it just is what it is. How do we know that you're legitimately greater than an Anthony Joshua? How do we know that you would 100% not lose to an Andrew Ruiz Jr. or an Alexander Usyk or some of these other fighters? It just is what it is. No offense against Deontay Wilder. But there's a reason why I've always usually put Anthony Joshua above him. It just is what it is, and I still do. Because Anthony Joshua has those wins over Joseph Parker, Andrew Ruiz, Vladimir Klitschko, which is a much greater win than any of the wins overall in Deontay Wilder's career. It just is what it is. He also has a win, I believe, over Kubrat Pulev. He has a win over Alexander Povetkin, Dillian White. A lot of these guys were some of the best heavyweights of their day. Who does Deontay Wilder really have on his resume? All he has is Luis Ortiz. Bermain Stavern is decent, but he's not really great. It just is what it is. So Deontay Wilder, even though he was a decently great heavyweight for his day, he cannot even be remembered as the second greatest heavyweight of his day unless he actually were to get in the ring with Anthony Joshua and beat him. So it is what it is.
Once to Alexander Usyk, bigger than the Tyson Fury versus Alexander Usyk fight. And even if Deontay Wilder were continuing to fight, and and got back to a scenario where if Tyson Fury retired and he was still the best heavyweight, even though Tyson Fury retired, I don't really think that would ever get him beyond where he is. Beyond where he is right now, which is a guy that was a great American heavyweight fighter. And again, there's nothing wrong with retiring in that regard, man. You have a lot of people, like George Foreman. George Foreman was somebody that was really, is a great fighter early in his career, and lost by a knockout loss to George Foreman, to Muhammad Ali, and wind up, where he didn't wind up being the best heavyweight of his era, or the guy that,
No, George Foreman was not the best heavyweight of his era. That was Muhammad Ali. But at the end of the day, what George Foreman can at least claim over Deontay Wilder, because both of them were both Plan A fighters and brawlers when it came down to it, But what George Foreman can claim is that he actually has a big win over that of a Joe Frazier. So it just is what it is.
A lot of people thought he was, but he's still a Hall of Fame fighter that made a comeback later on in his career, became worth 300, 400 million with the George Foreman grills. So you never know how things pan out. But there can only be one guy that is the best. And honestly, I think it's only fair to say that that was Tyson Fury. And I don't know what Deontay Wilder beating the other lower level heavyweights are going to do other than to obviously add money to his bank account, but also put his health at risk, put his life at risk.
Well, what it would prove if Deontay Wilder was actually able to beat those fighters, it would prove that maybe he is actually officially the second best heavyweight of his era. Right now, he's not even that. But it is what it is.
You know, once somebody really goes through that type of knockout and that type of, you know, punishment that he endured, you know, a lot of those guys go through that and they're not the same. And when you're ahead,
I agree. And I can bet you money on this. Deontay Wilder is not the same fighter after that fight.
Heavyweight and getting hit by guys that big, it really doesn't take that much to cause a lot of damage in your head. Deontay Wilder said it himself. He's like, you know, the human body, the human head is not meant to take that much punishment, and it took a lot. So if he wants to have a long life where, you know, he has his faculties about him, you know, he doesn't have slurred speech and all of that good stuff, it very well may be a good time for him, you know, to pack it up and call it a day. So if
I would agree.
If he ultimately makes that decision, you know, I would support it. I don't think it's a bad decision. If he does decide to fight on, he definitely can probably beat every other heavyweight that's not named Tyson Fury, but I definitely believe Tyson.
I'm not so sure about that. Like I said, all that is alleged. You know, it is what it is. We'll see. Now, would I be surprised if he were able to do that? I wouldn't be shocked. But, you know, we'll see. A great fight, I think, for Deontay Wilder's return actually would be that of Andrew Ruiz Jr. If he could get Andrew Ruiz Jr. to sign on, I don't know. But we'll see. I'll know what happens. The reason why I think that would be a great fight is because I think that would be a winnable fight maybe for Deontay Wilder. It could be a 50-50 fight, you know. And on top of that, you know, it would do great numbers. It would do very good for Deontay Wilder's career if he could potentially get that victory. And on top of that, when it comes down to it, it could get him a very decent paycheck.
Tyson Fury, that matchup is gone by the wayside. Tyson Fury and that matchup between the two guys, and you know, you say styles make fights. That style, unless something really went wrong with Tyson Fury, I don't really think that Tyson Fury, you know, that.
I agree, and kudos to you, sir, for finally admitting it, because you got a lot of these other channels out here where Deontay Wilder fans that will still go on this narrative that Tyson Fury cheated, blah, blah, blah. And maybe Fannon still goes on that. I don't know. But I'll give him more credit overall for someone admitting that Tyson Fury, that he's just a better fighter.
He's going to be able to beat that.
And he is. Tyson Fury, what he is, he's basically the Muhammad Ali of this era. It just is what it is. You know, he can fight in a multitude of ways. When it comes down to it, he's a very decent athlete. Is that me saying necessarily that I think that he's 100% as talented as what Muhammad Ali was? No, but what I will say is this. I actually don't think it's as far apart as what many people like to claim. A lot of people, especially with current fighters, depending on who they are, they always say, oh, well, don't you dare compare him to that guy. Don't you dare compare him to that. Why not? Tyson Fury, at the end of the day, he's someone who's undefeated. He's someone, all in all, that at one point in time has claimed all the titles within the heavyweight division. And on top of that, he's proven that he's very skilled for his size. You don't expect someone that is about, you know, almost 300 pounds when it comes down to be as fast, as quick, and have as good and fastest feet as him and fight in a multitude of ways that he can fight. So Tyson Fury very clearly is an all-time great fighter.
And I don't think that they're going to readdress that issue. So, you know, if he winds up retiring, man, salute to that king, man, for doing that, for having an excellent career. One of the most exciting and fun times I've ever had watching a fighter fight in his wins and in his defeat. So my hats would go off to him. But anyway, that's my take on the situation. You let me know what you think.
I never was overly excited watching Deontay Wilder because I never thought that he was that skilled. But that doesn't mean that he did not have some entertaining knockouts. But it is what it is. I really do hope that maybe Deontay Wilder will fight maybe once or twice more. But if he decides to retire, I certainly would understand the decision. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for this video. We will see all in all where this goes. In my opinion, my advice to Deontay Wilder would be really feel it out. You know, if you were to come back in a fight, I think that Andrew Ruiz Jr. would be the best option. But we'll see all in all what happens. But anyways, we'll see what happens with this. Should be very interesting. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.